stop him because they just enjoy talking to him. His beard has experienced more than a lesser man's entire body. He once punched a magician. That's right, you heard me. He is the most interesting man in radio. My friends, there is only one place I like to come to talk in the morning. It is with Rob Pratt. He is even more interesting than I am. Stay listening, my friends. This is News Radio 1020, KDKA.
All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Rob Pratt Show for a Sunday morning. Before we go any further, a big shout-out to the PA Coal Alliance and the hardworking folks who mine the industry of coal. Last night at the beautiful Pepsi Roadhouse in Burgettstown, sellout crowd, the governor, the keynote speaker, former state senator John Pippy, now the CEO of the Alliance, who is in the midst of spending the morning in Indian Gap, Pennsylvania. He's going to be a part of the March for Soldiers, 28-mile hike. So he and I were talking late last night as he was making his way to Indian Gap, and I somehow found myself in Weirton, West Virginia. But I had a great ride home last night, spent some time with some old friends, and obviously enjoyed every minute of it. And coming up later on in the program, I had a chance to catch up with the governor and Mr. Pippy to talk about the future of coal in this country. You do not want to miss it. And some comments about Gretchen Wilson, who literally blew the roof off the place last night. Just a tremendous performance by one of the best country stars in the world. All right, now, let's welcome to the program Lou Gentile, CSI investigators from, of course, Living with Confidence, Impacts, and, of course, his Traveler's Guide to Personal Security, and something that would give even yours truly confidence, a book that is all about being a warrior. We will talk to you about that in a little bit. Sam Rosenberg is here. Mr. Zelkowitz, as in Sandy Zell, is here. His lovely bride, Barbara, is here as well. And also on the 84 Lumber Project Professional Newsline, Rabbi Stephanie Wolf. She is from Beth Samuel Synagogue in Ambridge, Pennsylvania. It is wonderful to have you here this morning, Rabbi. Thanks for getting up early and spending some time with us on KDK. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Now, you're probably aware of this, but Mr. Zell, please step forward and talk to the audience about your father's connection. And we've had you on many times in the past to talk about his survival of World War II and his stay at a concentration camp and how he came to this country and really with nothing, I believe, left a lasting legacy, not an empire as far as monetarily, but what he has done spiritually and obviously with one of the best families I have ever met in my life. Your two brothers, your mom, your children, great people. Your second son, if you will, is now living in Israel. But your father not only did amazing things in business, but also was very spiritual and was one of the founding members of this synagogue in Ambridge, which actually started, I believe, where Maple's restaurant is now. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Tell the story, please. Good morning.
1960. Prior to that, the Maple restaurant on Maplewood Avenue was the synagogue, and the community was expanding. And my father and a few people got together and decided they needed a synagogue, so everybody mortgaged their life and their first two children.
Tell the audience what your dad did and how he stepped up to the plate with this no-interest kind of loan that back then or even today, in my standards, a whole lot of money, and he took a huge risk for his faith.
Yeah, he took a note out to make the pledge to help build the synagogue, which is probably about 2 times his salary at the time, which is unbelievable. But that's what they did. I mean, family and community and maintaining Jewish way of life in the community.
You know, last night as I was making my way through eastern Ohio and coming home, I had stopped at a stop sign, and I was just looking at this street, West 5th Street in East Liverpool, where I spent many days as a young broadcaster at the radio station there. And there is a synagogue on the corner that I remember so well and how it always stood out in my mind, how it's been such a part of the fabric of that community, and through all of the ups and downs that community has had, it is still there. And the same as in Ambridge. And I was actually dropping a gift off for my friend Attorney Ross, who is running for judge, and his offices with Lucky Buyers are adjacent to this beautiful synagogue that I have known about for a long time because of our relationship, Sandy. So I wanted to begin with you, if I could, Rabbi, for just a couple of moments before we get into the state of Israel and their strength through faith and obviously family and how they take serious their freedom and what they did to stake their claim in this place that they call their own Israel many, many years ago. But if you can, talk about the roots of not just your synagogue, but the faith here in America and those who came from, Israel and beyond, and obviously the mass exodus after World War II to obviously keep the great tradition of being Jewish alive in America.
Well, I think that faith, faith in general is an important idea, but certainly the people who came to America and to Israel after World War II had to start over from having nothing and having suffered and really build their lives, really having gone through what none of us can even begin to imagine. And so those who had been in the concentration camps and those who had hidden and been partisans all had gone through such tragedy. And so they went to Israel and they built a country. And while there had been people in Israel building that country, these people who were the Holocaust survivors really changed the face of Israel.
Well, and they also changed the face of this country. And what I marvel the most, and Lou, jump in here real quick, is their faith coming here, and after what many of them were fortunate enough to survive, and Rabbi obviously talked about it, World War II and the concentration camps, to them, taking a gamble in business was really nothing. And they believed as long as they had family and their faith, they could survive anything. And obviously that's what Sandy's father did when he started that synagogue. They knew they would not be strong, not just as, Jews, but a part of this country and in Israel, unless they were strong and obviously put everything towards their faith.
Well, excuse me. I think that's precisely why I'm here. I mean, obviously, I'm the only person here that's not Jewish, and that's what provoked our conversation when we were talking about faith and we were talking about family. So I'm certainly not the one to be talking about, although I can address some of the issues in regards to Israel. But more importantly, I am struck by and awed by and admire the faith and the cohesiveness of the Jewish people. As you know, I come from a long history of law enforcement. I won't bore you with the details, but in my history of law enforcement, very, very infrequently do you find a lot of young Jewish children having the problems that many of our young people have today. I'm struck by the character of the Jewish children in my classes at the University of Pittsburgh. 60, 70 people, and they stand out. They stand out because of their tenacity in their studies. And when they approach you, almost humbly, when they approach you and say, Professor, I have this holiday that I have to celebrate. Is that going to be an excused absence? And I mean, they take these holidays so very seriously. But I think most importantly, as I study more about world religions and I become closer to a lot of my Jewish friends, including but not limited to my good friend here, Sam Rosenberg, I'm so struck by the whole issue of things like the Sabbath and ceremony, and how this is the cohesiveness that holds these families and this people together.
Rabbi, before I let you go, and again, thank you so much for getting up early today to spend some time with us. Lou hits on a very good point. We struggle with, many of us who are proud to be, whether we are Irish or whether we are Italian or African American, to keep the history and tradition of our family alive. But it seems as though in the Jewish faith that it's not that difficult, and they do connect. When it is the Seder or that Passover time of year, they understand what they must do before they do anything else. Why do you think the faith has been able to touch the lives of the younger generation to a point where they don't need to be told twice that it's time to shut it down and be with family and to pray and to be thankful for what you have?
Well, I think that it has to do with the fact that Judaism is more than just a religion, that it's cultural too. And so I think that as our kids are educated, they're brought up in an entire cultural idea. And so the values that are taught to them from a very young age through education, about ritual. And because the home is the base of Judaism, so the synagogue is very, very important, but what they do at home is equally important. And so their parents are very involved. And that's why for our synagogue, Lou Zell was such an important person. He made that commitment to the synagogue, but he also really made that commitment at home. And so that commitment, he raised this family that was made the commitment to Judaism and continues to make that commitment, even though none of them live in Ambridge, they continue to make that commitment to the Beth Samuel Jewish Center because Judaism is important to them. So I think that is how the tradition continues to get passed on. People just are afraid of Judaism dying out, and so they continue to make it live.
Well done. Rabbi Stephanie Wolf, Beth Samuel Synagogue in Ambridge, thank you so much for joining us today on the 84 Lumber Project Professional Newsline.
Thank you for having me.
Isn't it also kind of ironic that your father basically sold out, speaking of 84 Lumber, Joe Hardy, my dear friend, your father, one of the first, Steel City Lumber, what he was able to do, and he created what apparently went on to become 84 Lumber. It's a very small world, Mr. Zell, isn't it?
Extremely.
We'll be right back. All right, let me tell you again about these books. And this is me pimping these books, not Mr. Rosenberg. This is how much I really respect what he does. The Way of the Warrior and also Traveler's Guide to Personal Security. Amazon is where you can get them, a must. And I think that for those of you who've gotten to know him in the recent months that he has been on the air with us, you understand why I'm so high on what he does. You were talking, Sam, by the way, good morning. Great to have you back at KDKA, but you were talking about the Jewish Community Center with Sandy and his wife Barbara a little while ago. And obviously we had one in Chippewa, Pennsylvania for years. Dr. Abraham Twersky was really the monarch, the man down there for many years. It really is still, no matter what those of the Jewish faith are doing, and I think that's why have been so successful with the state of Israel and overcoming so much in Hezbollah and what's happening with Syria and all that stuff that we're going to get into, because they've always had this sense of a gathering place, whether it be at their home, whether it be at their synagogue, or whether it be at the community center. They just understand their strength in numbers, don't they?
Oh, absolutely, Rob. It's the sense of community is critical, and I think that's something. I was flying back from California just last night, and I was chatting with this elderly woman next to me, and we had a really nice conversation. She was not Jewish, but we had a very, very interesting conversation about faith, and we both basically at the end of this hour-long discussion agreed that one of the missing links in our society right now is a sense of community. I think with people, and you see kids nowadays, they're just so disaffected in so many ways. They go home and they get on a social media site and, they talk with their friends, and there's all these dynamics, but there really is a real breakdown in the old-fashioned sense of community. And when I was growing up, that was one of the things that we always had from the standpoint of the Jewish community. And I was just telling the Zells here, that I basically, from Pittsburgh, grew up in the Jewish Community Center. I used to go to the gym there, walk about an hour from my house to there every day after school, work out with a group of people there that were my friends, so to speak, there that, I didn't really have much to do with other than the fact that, we would all congregate there and hang out and work out and do our thing. And then walk an hour home. And, the routines of that were something special back in those days.
Sandy, how important was family to your dad? Because he worked very hard. What he built didn't happen. A lot of sweat equity. But what was it that made him realize through it all, no matter where you were, what you were doing, when it was time to gather at your home, that's exactly what you did?
Family was his primary interest, period. Everything else was secondary. I guess because he followed the tradition that it should be known from one generation to the next. And his priority was to make sure that the next generation understood. He gave you the values and understood the rules. It was up to you to endorse it.
True patriots in every sense of the word. But one thing I have noticed, and, Steven Spielberg is someone who comes to mind, the fortunes that they amass through hard work, they give countless, tens of thousands, millions in some cases of dollars back to the state of Israel. Why do you think they do that, Lou?
The same things to perpetuate that culture, that whole sense of community, faith. It's all integrated together. It's very important. It's very important to them.
Was it important to your dad, and obviously your second son being there? And thank you for explaining to me what a kibbutz is. It took me a while to figure it out, but I finally, it takes a kibbutz to build a family, right, or something like that.
Yeah.
But why was it important to your dad to make sure that the state of Israel was doing okay too, as he was doing okay here in the States, and anything that he had to do to, give a hand, he would do it?
Yeah. The one thing you have to understand is Israel is the only country in the world that would accept any Jew at any time. You know, we say that we're Italian Americans, we're Irish Americans, but if, God forbid, something happened in this country, could all the Irish people flood to Ireland? Could all the Italians flood back to... The Jews could always go to Israel and be taken.
Did you know that?
I did know that, you know, and I did know that.
I didn't know
and
that.
You know, and I have a number of very prominent Jewish friends, and when we talk about politics, and you ask, you know, where are they aligned? They only have one issue. They said, you know, whoever is pro-Israel, that's who I'm voting for. Period. End of story. That is the only dominant issue.
That's pretty amazing. Being that I know you, you think I got a connection, maybe I can get in if I need to get in. That's now to me, that's what a country's all about.
We can put a word in for you.
Thank you very much. But see, I mean, they get it. They just get it, Lou.
But not that you'll ever... It's like having 160 miles an hour available on your speedometer. Not that I'll ever use it, but just knowing it's there.
But Sam, it said safety net, knowing that, you know what, it's like when you're a little kid and the bullies are chasing you down a dark alley, you're just 2 doors down from your mom and a plate of spaghetti if you could just get to the light. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's what it's all about. And that to me is essential in this world.
But you know, the people in Israel, you know, I was just there 2 months ago. I have first cousins that live there. Their thought process is totally different than ours. I mean, last fall, the missiles were shooting from, you know, just across the border. They're proactive and they're vigilant as a community. Service is mandatory. Conscription is a part of Israel's way of life.
Don't move. Much more still to come. Plus, we will revisit his father's remarkable story that will make all of you understand why I felt this was such a necessary hour. We'll be back. I never knew that.
Hey, you learned something.
All right, we're back. We are obviously paying tribute to the state of Israel. And I think everyone can learn something from this hour. But I think unity is what it's all about. Sandy, you were giving me some numbers. And if I were a betting man, and as Ted Arnott would say, for entertainment purposes only, I mean, these are odds that I might take, but 200 to 1?
Yeah.
Explain to the audience what you told me, and then we're going to have Sam and Lou talk about security, and maybe they can make some sense on how you all still standing is what I want to know.
The general population of Israel is not only Jewish, but they have Arabs, they have Druze, they have, you know, an international consortium in addition to. The only difference is that the Arabs are not allowed to serve in the military. But when I say proactive and vigilant, you know, we have NRA stuff here, everybody's armed, so military coming to our land here, look out because every door has a shotgun sitting at it. But in Israel, the community is trained military because military service is mandatory. So from a young age, 18, you either do community service or you're going to the military. For men, it's 3 years. For women, it's 2. And then you go on reserve till like age 54. So you can be called up at any time. And you still have to go through training every year, a couple of weeks, like the National Guard does. Same thing. So it's a whole different mindset. The citizenry of Israel is military-based. So that's being proactive.
So as much as the economy is as important to them, so is their military.
Security is number one, period.
Sam, are we missing something in this country? And do you agree with Mr. Zell that that's the reason why they are still solvent and still stand alone? And as his wife Barbara mentioned, no matter where she went, they were recently there, she felt safe.
Yeah, you know, I think there's a lot of reasons, but that is one of the most fundamental reasons that I always talk about. And when I talk about security, it's hard for me not to mention Israel in some capacity, Rob, because, you know, the thing is that the mindset is so different over there. I'll give you a perfect example. You know, last week we were talking about, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? We were talking about the Boston bombing. Last week.
Yep.
We were talking about the Boston bombing, and I made this comment that, you know, one of the reasons why I fundamentally believe, you know, bad guys are successful not because they're particularly good, but because good guys in this country have no idea really what to look for, okay? Give you a perfect example. One of the survivors of the Boston incident that tragically lost his legs, this guy named Jeff Bowman. You know, there was an image of him in a wheelchair that everybody pretty much saw in this country. It was graphic and it was terrible. But the thing that was interesting about it to me was after the fact, After he got out of his surgery, first thing he did was report to the FBI that he had seen one of the Tsarnaev brothers drop the bag right at his feet. And he gave a very detailed description of this guy. So he made eye contact with the bomber, saw him place the bag with the bomb in it right at his feet, made eye contact. It affected his intuitive faculties enough that he remembered the guy to a T, exactly what he was wearing, what he looked like, that he can give a detailed description, but he didn't say anything. He didn't do anything about it. Now, this isn't playing Monday morning quarterback. It's just saying, again, the culture here is so different that no one really knew to make anything of that. And the reality is, in Israel, everything is so vastly different that even when you're talking about things like terrorism, for example, and I've made this point numerous times and I present, the advent of the suicide bomber is a direct result of Israeli security and preparedness. They're so good at spotting the pre-incident indicators and the warning signs of violent behavior that they've effectively made it very difficult, almost impossible, for conventional attacks to take place and to be successful. So the terrorists have to take such an extreme measure to try and even succeed that they have to, strap a bomb on a kid and try and smuggle him through a crowd. And the reality is, in Israel, they stopped so many of those. We don't even hear about it. We couldn't even conceive, quite honestly, of the level of security and how capable they are there, and what their effectiveness is. Now, here in this country, we're extremely effective too. You remember John Hudson last week mentioned for every one of these that we hear about, there's 100 we don't that have been stopped. I've been reading all the reports. There were 3 or 4 significant terrorist incidents or potential terrorist plots that had been thwarted in the last few months, significant ones, including the one up in Toronto. So, the idea here is that it really is paramount. Security is paramount. And as Lou always says, we're really tired of it being something that is considered second. It's like a second string issue here in this country. It's a fundamental human need, and it's everyone's responsibility, and we have to start taking it as such.
Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria, obviously the evil part of the world in the minds of many. And you were talking about that sea, that they basically are the captain of their own ship. Talk about where they are situated geographically and how really, no matter where they look, they're bad guys in Israel.
When I, back, a number of years ago, when I protected Benjamin Netanyahu and some of his cabinet, when we were doing some close protection work for them, it was during a speaking tour, and Prime Minister Netanyahu made a really impressive speech. He's the only person that I know of who actually did a really good job of providing what I consider to be a viable solution to terrorism. And he would talk about this. And the dynamic is that if you go back historically, militarily, and you look at it, the only types of government that wage aggressive war on their neighbors are dictatorships. All right, they're the rule of the few, and Israel is the only democracy in a sea of dictatorships. And the dynamic here is that it's so vital geopolitically for the United States to protect Israel and to support Israel. Regardless of the cultural dynamics, from a security perspective, you have to have that base there, because terrorists can't survive in a democracy. They will eventually be found out very quickly, and they need governmental support. And they have to have a supporting agency like Iran, for example, for them to function.
Lou, and we were talking about, Hezbollah and the drone, obviously, that everybody has been talking about. And is Israel, from a security standpoint, something do they focus more on protecting themselves and stopping you as opposed to whatever you're doing? And all of the talk about, Ahmadinejad as far as, nuclear weapons and what they're trying to do in Iran, they understand that the bad guy's always going to try to one-up them. So it's not really, they'll pay attention, but it's more about being on the defense as opposed to being on the offense. You agree or disagree with that?
In regards to Israel?
Yeah.
It's about being on the defense. I mean, look at the situation that they're in here. I mean, thank goodness, the most recent visit with President Obama. I mean, that was a pretty stark, statement that he made, that as long as the United States, is around, then they will always be, the supporter, the first supporter of Israel. I mean, that was pretty profound, and he made it. He made it in Israeli, by the way. He made it in Jewish. It was quite a statement. And that's indicative of how of how we feel about the country. At least most of us feel about the country. But they're in a precarious position. I mean, look what's happening even all around them in Syria. I mean, everyone is hollering now about there's 70,000 or so Syrians that are being killed, and it's a tough situation. But when you really look at it, who do we give support to? It's either give support to Hezbollah or give support to Al Qaeda. So that's the predicament that we're in. And Israel is right in the middle of that. They're right in the nucleus of that. So it's a tough call.
My only criticism of the president in Israel, if I were president, my frequent flyer miles with Air Force One would be used immediately with Israel. And I know it took him some time, and he did make a wonderful statement, and I'm proud to say he is our president, and I support him. But, Sandy, as we were saying off the air, and I don't know anywhere near as much about the great state of Israel as you do, but we can ill afford to lose them as a friend. I don't think we survive as a nation without Israel at our side. You agree or disagree? And obviously you're a little biased, but I want to hear what you have to say.
Obviously I'm a little bit biased, but if you make the analogy of how we were attacking communism and why democracy must sit, because what's communism? It starts with a dictator, just as Sam said, and dictatorship will always create the evil, and the democracy is the only thing and that can thwart that off. But the terrorists can't, as Sam said very eloquently, terrorists can't survive in democracy. And that's the democracy there that's going to keep terrorism from making the ultimate spread.
Well, and it's always about jealousy. It's always about wanting to be something you can't. And I think that's why Israel has always been in the crosshairs of terrorism, because they can never live up to what that great state has done and overcome. And instead of joining and becoming, having an allegiance with them, they want to topple them. And it's been tried for generations, and I truly believe that it won't happen. And I mean that seriously. We'll come back. And why are they so, I guess, conscious of their freedom and proud of their freedom, those from Israel? Once we share this story that we've shared many times with Sandy, and it's kind of like, that movie that you fall in love with the first time, you just want to see it over and over and over. And every time I hear it, I take away something different from it. That's next on The Rob Pratte Show. Stay tuned. All right. We're back, ladies and gentlemen. We've got Sandy Zell, his wife Barb is here, also Sam Rosenberg, the author of Traveler's Guide to Personal Security and The Way of a Warrior. Get him at Amazon.com. He's also the man behind Living with Confidence and Impex, and, of course, CSI Investigators, who he works closely with. Lou Gentile is here, former director of the Bureau of Narcotics, longtime member of the state police force in this great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And Lou has seen it all, ladies and gentlemen. And when Lou Gentile speaks about certain things on my show, and when he gives it a thumbs up, I know I did good. And after hearing Sandy tell his story that I have heard many times, and as I said, I always take something different from it, I knew that we did good. And what was it? And I don't know if I've ever really asked you, other than I was just so shocked that you found it so overwhelming and just significant and full of value that you actually made a call to me, Lou, to talk about it. But I never got a chance to respond because I was so stunned that you were so moved by this story that has been part of our history books for generations. What was it about Sandy's story about his father's survival of a concentration camp that made you want to pick up the phone and call me that day?
It's after I was done reading the book on Auschwitz, and I was so troubled by it that I could only read maybe 20, 25 pages at a time. I'm talking to my brother about it, who's a salesman, and he's in North Carolina. And just by coincidence, I'm saying, Rob, you know what, we talked about this, and I don't see my brother very often, and we try to get as much, catch up as frequently as we can. And I'm telling him about this book, and he says, funny you mentioned that. He says, I was just at a conference, he says, and I was talking about Hitler, and I was talking about Auschwitz to this young man who's a salesman for Schindler escalators and elevators. I said, I said, really? I said, I bet you spent 20 minutes, just trying to rationalize it and say he wasn't involved and how most people were not even aware of it. And he said, I'm going to tell you something, Lou. He said, this guy didn't know where I was. And you were talking about 2012. He said he was about 35 years old. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know what religion I was. He didn't know I was married to. And he said, the only problem with the Holocaust is that we didn't finish the damn job. 2012. 2000, and you know what? It was chilling. It was chilling to me. And that attitude, quite frankly, is still too pervasive in our society. And that's not to, hey, listen, that's not that Israel is a great state. It's not to say that there's not controversy, as there is in every great state, as in every great democracy. I mean, are there controversies to what's happening with the Palestinians? Of course there is.
Yeah, but they have a way to work through it, though.
They have a way to work through it. They have a way to work through it. But I mean, this attitude, this pervasive attitude, quite frankly, is chilling to me.
And it's ironic, the company named Schindler, obviously Schindler's List, if you've seen the movie, and I'll tell you, grown adult, when I saw it, I almost walked out on a number of occasions, and to this day, when I'm channel surfing and that movie comes on, I can't watch it.
Yeah.
I can't. Sandy, your father, let's talk about your wonderful dad. I met every member of your family, but I wasn't fortunate enough to meet your dad. I want to talk about your father a little bit, and more importantly, what he saw and overcame. And I just want everybody in the audience just to take a minute. I don't care what you're doing on this Sunday morning, and just give me a few minutes of your time. Go ahead, Sandy.
Well, he came from a family in Hungary, and when they went door to door, and as a young man, he was sent to be educated, because in Europe at that time, you either learned a skill or you went to school. Well, my father went to school, went to Budapest, and from his time, when the Germans started invading the country, went back to be home with his family. And the short story is they divided at Auschwitz, and he was with his father and the rest of the family, 9 uncles, aunts, cousins, 5 brothers and sisters. He were split up at that time, and from there he was in Dachau and Buchenwald. And, in April of 45, when he was liberated, the same thing, the soldier march and the tanks coming through, the Americans were coming through, the soldiers dropped their guns and they took off, and the tanks come through, and here's the Americans being saved. And the funny part is, when my father first came to this country, I didn't speak English, finally had the opportunity to come here. 6 months later, he's drafted to the United States Army. And back at that time, as a orphan, if you will, he's a frontliner. And people would always ask him, how could you go to the Army after? And my father says, very simple. Number one, how could I ever repay the greatest country in the world that liberated me? And he said, and this time I had a gun in my hands. It was a lot easier.
Knowing your sense of humor, I would have loved to have heard that. Here's how you can put it in its proper place. Tattoos have become the thing today, and I have a few. And most people get them to commemorate something good in their life, okay? No one really does anything to put anything on their body with ink to remember something bad.
Correct.
But every tattoo, a number that these Jews had the rest of their lives, those who survived, when they were getting a shower, they were picking their baby up off the floor, they were doing work on the job, whatever the case may be, and they saw that number that was tattooed, branded on their wrist, they thought of death and loved ones who were murdered in cold blood.
But the safety zone always was. God forbid it should happen again, which it never will. My dad could always take his family and go to Israel. So why wouldn't he support? That was like his second passport available to him, always.
So that was kind of like his way of getting away from the boogeyman in a way. I mean, knowing that he could go to Israel. And what a safety net that is.
Yes. I mean, back when these people were starting here, building their businesses, building their families, they were still buying bonds to build Israel, because that was their investment in their future and the future of their generations.
Sandy, I mean, Lou, Sam, Barb, how did they live? I mean, there's only so much to go around. And your dad became very successful, but a lot of hard work, and your brothers and you were right there at his side. But how did he make enough to survive?
How? Because their philosophy was different than ours. If you had 2 nickels, one was available. That was the philosophy. It was a perpetuation of generation. They lost everything. How do we perpetuate? That was the main concern, to perpetuate and tell from one generation to the next. So it's not indigenous to them. It's a premeditation that Israel has to exist. The amount of anti-Semitism in Europe is up over 35% over the last 2 years. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sam.
You're definitely not wrong.
And the Nazi skinhead groups. I mean, I could go on and on. Sam knows them in detail much better than I do. The influence of the bombings in the synagogues are going. You know what? The dust is circling again, but it won't happen again.
It is circling again.
Hey,
and when you would talk about no one to put ink on their body unless it's something good. Talk about some of these Nazis and skinheads, and I will tell you,
you're right, Lou.
It's quite the opposite.
You're right. You're right.
I mean, think about it like this, Rob. How in the world can there even be something called a Holocaust denier? Oh, how's it even possible?
Don't get me started.
How's it even possible? We have celebrities in this country.
Who, Lou Farrakhan?
No, we're talking about Mel Gibson, for God's sake. People like Mel Gibson who don't even think.
What's he thinking?
Publicly say that the Holocaust never happened. I mean, it's unbelievable. How's it possible? I used to like that
Schindler's List should be seen in every high school. I mean, it should be mandatory. And as much as I'll even go sit with the students, and I hated that movie. That movie, and I said it before, and I'll say it again. I can't see, and please understand what I mean by this, but if I were Jewish, I could understand why I would have no love for the German people. And I mean, and God save me for saying that, but the hatred. I mean, it was just horrible. I mean, generations, families, babies, grandparents, they were just slaughtered. Animals have had a more peaceful death than what these people went through. Clamoring and clinging to life with their nails, puncturing each other's skin as they were watching their children die. Are you kidding me?
Think of the precedents if Israel doesn't survive. Look at what goes on in countries in Africa and Uganda.
It's still,
Bosnia,
I know.
The ethnic cleansing.
Idi Amin, we could go down. I know.
Okay, so think of the precedents if Israel doesn't survive. But with today's technology and social media and the World Wide Web and news sources available to us, we know what goes on in these countries. What do we do? The United States knew what was going on in Europe in 1938. What did they do? Question mark. I'm not saying right or wrong.
I know, deaf ear. I know.
But what's going on in some of these countries and around the world today? What are we doing?
Nothing.
Israel has to survive because they're the precedents.
Sandy, Zell, Barb, thank you. Sam, Lou, much more than I could have asked for this hour. We'll have to do it again. We'll be back.
It's the least we could do.